I've had a lot of cause to think about Star Wars recently. There's a certain corner we've turned with both the teasing of upcoming films as well as the release of the final season of Andor and the re-release of The Revenge of the Sith that gives me the sense we're riding a wave and waiting to fall before we crest another beautiful little cultural moment. I have my doubts that upcoming productions will gift me with the feelings Andor did, or even those that the prequel films did. I have a video about what that feeling is and where I think it comes from in Andor, but my real latest obsession has been to proactively litigate my opinions about the writing behind the sequel trilogy. Accordingly, it felt most provocative to begin with those things that I felt most disappointed by, which I traced back to the character writing for those films. I loved the actors, but felt some real, retroactive disappointment at the way their character arcs had been drawn out, often inconsistently, and quite thoughtlessly as well, or so I contended. When I think about what I hate most about the sequels, I think about lightsabers. I'm not talking about the types of lightsabers we see or don't see, or the way they're used, or who recovers from what stab wound. These are, despite what some people might tell you, so far down on the chain of command in terms of which decisions have power over these stories that I seriously question the preoccupation of anyone for whom those are among their chief criticisms. If those were the biggest problems with a Star Wars film or show, I would think it would have to be bereft of most substantive flaws. The issues with the sequel films run much deeper. There's an ostensible return here to the tone of the original trilogy's lightsaber fights, of which there are basically 3. The exchange of blows here matters far less than what Lucas is intent on showing the viewer with each shot. The reading that these older fights are about character and that the prequels regressed into characterless choreography is a common one. I feel it's untrue. The tendency to focus on the spectacle of specific shots and exchanges is absolutely maintained, and it follows a predictable pattern. George Lucas lets his prequel films develop a certain rhythm. The Phantom Menace opens with a few slow moments before anything is allowed to get blown up and anyone is allowed to get cut down. Several sequences in the film play out like they're mimicking other genre films, like the pod racing sequence or the descent into the Gungan city. Finally, we get one big named protagonist death on screen in Qui-Gon Jinn. But Attack of the Clones accelerates these circumstances, starting with another ship coming into the orbit of a planet, but this one is destroyed just after landing, as opposed to a few minutes later. Several similar genre sequences play out, like the bounty hunter car chase and the search for Jango Fett, but these are suffixed by a battle sequence that is more explicitly military than the previous film, and its deaths feel more numerous, more consequential, and more harrowing. Revenge of the Sith doesn't even let a ship land before the explosions start, and its major character deaths come quicker and eventually with more sorrow, while more of its narrative is occupied with that earlier military tone. The rhythm could be missed on a first viewing, but these films too are being constantly relitigated, and so more and more attention has been paid to their uniqueness. They're unlike what came before, but also unlike what came after. I think they're my favorite period of the Star Wars franchise. Nothing has quite recaptured the tone of this, although a few of the television series have tried. In accordance with this sense of rhythm, the lightsaber fights capture this escalating and increasingly desperate violence. One must imagine Luke Skywalker as every bit the equal of a Qui-Gon Jinn or a Mace Windu, at least at some level, but their panache is conveyed through a quiet aggression that the camera shows us directly but does not dwell on long enough to feel exactly like anything produced in the Disney era. No, these lightsaber fights and everything else about these movies came from a different time. Is this the worst thing about The Last Jedi? No, but it's a hint. Middle children are often neglected, and this is true of trilogies as well. It still astonishes me that this film, of all of them, is viewed by so many as a low point in its trilogy. I could understand if it were merely seen generally as the best of a bad batch, pun intended, where some might favor other eras of Star Wars more. That's how I feel. But when I set out to write about what happened with the reception of this film, what moved me was not that so many people didn't like it, how mundane of an observation that was and remains, but rather that the reasons given were often themselves quite conspicuous. This has remained true for much of Star Wars since, especially the streaming series created in the past few years. I still feel Ahsoka was a low point for me, although it wasn't an isolated incident and did have its redeeming qualities, like Ray Stevenson's acting. I suppose the flaw and strength in what I try to do here is that I like to pan for gold in the mud, drawing little redemptive observations out of larger dissatisfactions. I discussed in my video The Star Wars We Could Have Gotten how Lucas wasn't enthused with the sequel trilogy when he saw how it began. There was nothing new there, or little enough to feel compelling to him anyway. This is my problem with the sequels as well, among other issues, with how its main cast was written, as I've enumerated previously. But The Last Jedi is a weird film. It's new in a few ways, but it's also clearly repeating steps from the original trilogy to the degree that it can't escape the sense that everything we're seeing is more of an experimental retread. Still, these are qualities shared by The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, and those films feel to me much less well put together. The Last Jedi has a visual flair, for example, that those other films lack. It has colorful aesthetics, and frankly, I think complaints about its pacing are out of step with the amount of time The Return of the Jedi spends in Jabba's palace, or the frankly dissociative pacing of Abrams' two films. I'm not eager to level a criticism at one work in a series that is a better fit for other works in that same series, for the reason I'm reluctant to point out one specific member of a baseball team is wearing his uniform, or that one specific 5-year-old is shorter than her parents. Remarking that The Last Jedi isn't quite on Lucas's level is a dog bites man story. It's a Disney Star Wars film. It can be unfavorably compared with its predecessors in the manner you would any other Disney Star Wars film. I liked the old Nirvana before they sold out. We get it. But I'm ironically quite sympathetic to one specific critique of this film, and it's for the exact reasons I just stated. If I'm going to say all of that, then I have to admit that this film does in fact feel like a retread of the original trilogy, specifically a mix of The Empire Strikes Back and The Return of the Jedi in a few key ways. And since it is a retread, I must further acknowledge that the choices it doesn't make are more conspicuous than the ones it does, since the ones it does are the ones those other films already did, or close to them. This is my problem with The Last Jedi. It comes really close to doing something quite provocative with Rey and Kylo Ren, and then it mostly puts it off, only for The Rise of Skywalker to play footsie with the idea before setting it aside just as casually. Rey has a lot of the dark side in her. The Last Jedi establishes this. It's supposed to be important to her character arc. She does not, however, have much of a chance to struggle with this. She resists Snoke, denies Kylo Ren, and then walks away from them. The idea that she would be tempted to the dark side in The Rise of Skywalker then becomes laughable. She already won that fight prematurely in The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi would be twice the film that it is if one single thing had been changed. If Rey had become Kylo Ren's apprentice at the end of the film, and the Resistance had escaped some other way while Luke delayed the First Order. Not much would need to be changed, and in fact this would give more purpose to the arcs of the main cast in the next film, and totally remove the need for a Palpatine revival. I think the reason this didn't happen is basically that Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams had allegedly agreed upon the broad strokes of the films before The Last Jedi was ever made, and so there was a loose sense of how Rey and Kylo Ren would need to play off of each other in the final film, which would place them on opposite sides and give them that kind of under-nurtured enemies-to-lovers vibe that they have in The Rise of Skywalker. That seems like it would have been the reason. It isn't a good reason, in my opinion, unless you really like what I felt the final implication of that film is. See my video about the writing of Rey Skywalker for more details. I like the idea of a Rey that seriously makes us worried for her, a Rey that feels like her temptation towards darkness is more sincere and difficult to overcome, a Rey who is motivated more by what she wants than what other people think she is. Certainly the temptation of insatiable desire in the form of emotional insecurity feels very Anakin, and makes for a much more compelling descent into darkness, while also allowing for the third film to give us a new philosophical resolution to this problem. If Rey is setting about resolving Anakin's problem with Luke's teachings, what would that make her into? A self-transcending Lady Vader? Shout out to my old Expanded Universe fans, I think that's a really cool idea. Consider also the other problems this might solve. Putting Rey with Kylo Ren gives them more reason to play off of each other casually, while Kylo Ren then gets to flex his muscles as a real villain. Meanwhile, having the sacred Jedi texts with Chewbacca on the Falcon also means Finn could study and become a Jedi just as Rey is becoming more of a dark Jedi or Sith, which gives his character a more complete arc while giving him more of a chance to play off of Poe more directly. If we're focused more on our established characters and their existing relationships, we can focus more on what we already have and flesh those characters out in greater depth without succumbing to cast bloat by attempting to add more foils for each character. It's rare that one solution fits several problems simultaneously, but that's the beauty of storytelling. I think the real nail in the coffin for this fault in The Last Jedi, the real point that drives home just how true this observation is, the thing that makes it my ultimate favorite criticism of this film, is that it takes what The Last Jedi does well, giving Rey real agency based on her own desires, and actually carries it into the next film. The implication of this proposition is that we could have gotten a really cool and dark third chapter in the trilogy that maybe tells us something new and interesting about the Force and the dark side, which maybe Abrams wanted to do anyway with some of the Reborn Emperor stuff. This isn't just potential in the sense of an alternative film we could have gotten, it's potential in the sense of a locked away, latent energy bound up in the atomic structure of this story. You have to let a story be what it wants to be and become what it wants to become, and I'm not just saying that because I think goth Daisy Ridley would be cool as hell. No, the truth is that when you're writing a story, as a writer, you begin to experience a peculiar sensation. Theoretically, you're in charge of this work, and certainly, you're responsible for it, but it begins to take on a life of its own. I try to plan a little, but not too much. You have to let a story breathe. You have to let characters grow beyond what you had planned for them. It strikes me that if I were in a less charitable mood, as I have occasionally been of late, then I would say very little about the characterization of the Star Wars sequel trilogy feels planned. It feels at its most planned in certain cinematic moments, but these are images evoking feeling, not people drawing us into their personal lives. Seeing Kylo Ren kill Han Solo is certainly provocative, but when that moment passes, what does it leave us with? If it was good storytelling, I would think it would leave us with something that touches on the core of those characters, more similar to Luke gazing into the sun on Ahch-To as he passes into the Force, recalling what Yoda said in The Empire Strikes Back about how he was always looking to the horizon, but never focused on where he was. Now he looks to the horizon and is fully present, even as he atones for an error he made in the spirit of anticipating what was over the horizon, and he achieves total enlightenment as a Jedi. I feel that's a compelling visual paired with compelling storytelling. But Luke is one of the lucky ones. His arc is mostly contained to The Last Jedi, a single film. It is, therefore, more structurally straightforward. His part in the story is mostly over when the film ends, so the conclusion of his arc occurring in that moment makes sense. But Rey's arc, to me, is a failure to bite the bullet. And if that were to have happened, it would have to have happened in The Last Jedi. The Rise of Skywalker is too late. I think that's a shame. Even when I feel there are things about this trilogy that at least work on its own terms and in the context of its own vision, I still get the sense that a punch is being pulled somewhere. Tell a different story is a bad piece of feedback to give a writer, or in this case, a director. I like that The Last Jedi has a strong sense of what it wanted to do, even if it was very different from what I would have done. I just wish it had committed to the bit. If anything, I think that's its greatest flaw. And that's where I was going to end this video previously, believe it or not. I wasn't too intent on expanding this essay beyond the strict confines of the main thing I feel holds this film back. I don't think the majority of the ink I've spilled discussing issues with this movie adequately describes every little thing I personally would have done differently. Given that The Last Jedi has the strongest presentation of any film in the trilogy, the most coherent direction, and some of the best writing, it's easy to look at the frankly bad faith cultural reception of this film from huge sections of the internet and feel compelled to defend it. However, this doesn't really present the film positively, but rather non-negatively. I think you should probably have to actively make the case for a film rather than against criticisms of it in order to justify a positive take on it. And in general, I don't think being ahead of the Abrams films and about even with Rogue One is a great achievement. I still like the prequel films the best and treat the original trilogy with some extra charity for it being Lucas's first attempt. If I could be allowed very briefly to detour from criticisms to defenses, I will say that I've touched on a lot of bad faith criticisms of this film that I saw as intriguing cases of motivated reasoning and revealing ideology. There are others, however, that I feel are similar to what I've said here, but that I don't think are true, and in some ways, I think these reinforce my central thesis. I've seen people say that Rey doesn't sacrifice or lose anything or fail throughout this film, when the reality is that her whole arc in this film is the best it gets in the trilogy specifically because it's a coherent portrait of someone with competency who is nevertheless insecure and fails interpersonally. She can fight, sure, but tellingly, not yet against a regular full-power Kylo Ren, and that's it. She doesn't understand the Force, doesn't fully connect with Luke, fails to redeem Ben, fails to stop the First Order fleet from hunting her friends, and only at the end actually saves people, mainly in her triumphant moment lifting the rocks. This moment works because it's something she's doing for people who actually value her. They're her new family, and the need to find healthy connections is something Rey's arc in this film seems consistently concerned with. Shame about the rest of the trilogy. Like I said, I think a lot of what people tend to get wrong about this film also reinforces my thesis of what its central fault is. For example, Johnson has talked about being inspired by The Empire Strikes Back, and I think that comes through quite strongly in this film for better or for worse. I think what I'm saying in this video might cut against one or more of the common criticisms of this film, in the same way that my video about the writing of Rey's character cut against the idea that the problem with her is that she was just a Mary Sue. I try to level up the criticism that I give whenever I'm being negative about something, because in my view, being smug is always easier than being smart, and negativity should be earned. The watch phrase of smug criticism of The Last Jedi on YouTube is subversion of expectations. Bad critics have abused this phrase the same way that Christian evangelicals abuse the phrase deconstruction, where something that was once a term with utility for critique has become an emotionally charged label to imply something sinister about the person doing it. When Johnson sat down with Gentleman's Quarterly for a video interview, he had this to say about The Last Jedi. If you're hearing this version of it, it's because I couldn't get GQ to let me use the clip without demonetizing my video, so I'm going to read you the quote from the article version. I definitely didn't approach the entire thing as a meta exercise, because I think, first and foremost, it has to be an honest expression of what the characters are actually going through. It's not very interesting to just think in a meta way about Star Wars. At the same time, you're dealing with a story that's about heroes and about the younger generation meeting their heroes, and a generation that is now the older generation of heroes dealing with being role models for the younger generation, and still being human beings with faults and foibles, and somebody who has the role of a legend but who feels fallible as a human being. By the end of the movie, realizing the value that that legend has and realizing that their place is to step up and be that for the younger generation. When you're dealing with all these things, the legend that I grew up with were the characters in Star Wars. If I think about the thing in my life that's been the most consistent thing, it's been these movies. Anyone who makes a Star Wars movie today is, in some way, going to be engaging with their relationship with Star Wars itself. You see, the most common usage of any subversion of expectations among critics when discussing this film is at the meta level. But what does Johnson mean by this? The meta element of his work that Johnson is alluding to here is, pretty obviously, his relationship to the films as someone who is not George Lucas, but who is making a Star Wars film. I think this element would have been present regardless of who directed a Star Wars film. But Rian Johnson is himself a competent director, as shown not just in his more recent films, like Glass Onion or Knives Out, but also in some of his slightly older work, like Looper or his work on Breaking Bad. I haven't seen Brick or The Brothers Bloom yet, but I think the rest of it speaks for itself. Before we draw any other conclusions about what degree of subversion of expectations was really intended on Johnson's part, I think we need a bit more input from the man himself. Peter Scaretta's interview with Rian Johnson also yields some insights. Can you talk about subverting fan expectations in this film, and in particular the decision to kill Snoke? Yeah, I guess the first thing to say is coming into writing this or any story, the object is not to subvert expectation, the object is not surprise. I think that would lead to some contrived places. The object is drama, and in this case the object was figuring out a path for each one of those characters where we challenge them and thus learn more about each of them by the end of the movie. So that having been said, Kylo's arc in this movie, besides his relationship with Rey, I saw as the big arc for Kylo breaking down this kind of unstable foundation that he's on, and then building him to where by the end of the film he's no longer just a Vader wannabe. But he stepped into his own as a kind of quote-unquote villain, but a complicated villain that you understand, right? So with that in mind, the idea that Kylo would get to that place by the end of it led me to think, well, then what is Snoke's place at the end? And does that work with him just kneeling before Snoke at the end? No. If Kylo's got to get to a place of actual power, the ultimate expression of that would be him ascending beyond his master. And that also then gives the opportunity to have a great dramatic moment that you don't expect of getting Snoke kind of out of the way. So that really is where it all stemmed from. It was thinking about Kylo's path, thinking about where I wanted him to be at the end of the movie to set him up for the next film. And thinking, okay, that means we're going to clear away this slightly more familiar dynamic of the Emperor and the pupil. Clear the boards from that, and then that's much more exciting going into Episode 9. The notion of now we just have Kylo as the one they have to deal with. You can no longer take a rational guess at how the Snoke-Kylo thing is going to play out in the next movie. The object is not surprise, the object is drama. That's a very succinct and insightful summary, I feel, and it's been totally left by the wayside in so many disputes about this film. I agree that it would have been contrived to write a film that was just about trying to do the opposite of what the audience thought would happen, so I'm glad that's not what this film was. The biggest bait and switch, if anything, was Johnson's attempt to put Kylo Ren in the position of the big bad evil guy for the end of Episode 8 and the duration of Episode 9. I think that's a cool idea, and I wish it had been followed up on. Speaking of which, where does this leave us? Johnson and Scaretta have another exchange somewhat later in the interview about Luke specifically. When did you decide that Luke Skywalker had to die in The Last Jedi? It was something very early on that started to feel right to me. It was a process. It was very early when I kind of landed on where Luke's head was at, and what his arc was going to be in terms of moving on from someone who's decided the galaxy is better off without Luke and the Jedi, to fully embracing the galaxy needs a legend to believe in. I'm going to put this on my shoulders and be the legend of Luke Skywalker for everybody. When I knew that was his arc, I had the instant tinge of that means that's the place for him to die, because what else can he accomplish in the physical realm beyond that? That would be the place emotionally that would have the most impact for him to let himself go. I don't know what's going to happen in Episode 9 at all, but there's actually more potential for more interesting things in terms of his role in the final chapter if he moves into another realm. He could be a Force ghost haunting Kylo Ren. It's fascinating, isn't it? A lot more fascinating than him just tagging along with our heroes with a lightsaber. So to me, it opened up more potential, and it seemed like having a full film that is Luke's journey, it seemed like if there's any place in the trilogy where it's going to have the most potent place, it would be here. But believe me, I wasn't looking forward to doing it. When critics, and let's be honest, it's mostly posters and YouTubers, are behaving uncharitably to Johnson, they often imply that the audience was expecting Luke Skywalker to be like he was in the original trilogy, and then Johnson's film subverted that expectation by giving them the opposite. This is untrue in two ways. It's a misuse of the term in the context of writing, where a subversion of expectations is when the writer gives the audience one idea about what might happen, but then gives them something else. Luke Skywalker begins the film as a jaded version of his previous self, which is Johnson establishing his character. This brings us to the second way in which this is wrong, which is that Luke's character ends in a heroic place, even though it doesn't begin that way. Lucas killed off Obi-Wan when he no longer had anything for Alec Guinness to do in the script. Johnson gave Luke an arc, that's the drama mentioned earlier, but when Luke no longer has anything to do, he exits the stage. This is, after all, not his trilogy. I still don't think anything in the sequel trilogy has the weight of Luke facing off against Vader in Return of the Jedi. It's not just that this character moment with Luke, looking at his mechanical hand and Vader's missing one after he cuts it off, is the result of something that has been built to over the course of several films. It also adds layers of extra meaning to elements from the previous films, like Luke seeing his own face on the apparition of Vader in the cave on Dagobah. In A New Hope, Lucas told Vader killed his father. Famously, this isn't the case, and the Dagobah cave scene foreshadows both Luke's mistake in confronting Vader at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, as well as the fact that Vader is his father, and Vader will try to turn him. The fact that those three elements occur in succession after being foreshadowed is the kind of thing you can get from The Last Jedi that doesn't really work in The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, because Abrams seems to have had a harder time stringing those films together, scene to scene. But Return of the Jedi flips this all around. Luke sees the good in Vader and tries to relate to him, reinforcing the juxtaposition of their relationship to the light and dark sides of the Force. The shot with the hands comes right after Vader provokes Luke to attack him in anger, which occurs as a version of the Emperor's theme plays. Subsequently, the Emperor tries to recruit Luke to take his father's place. The imagery and symbolism from The Empire Strikes Back is being given a new meaning here, which in my opinion is part of why Return of the Jedi is a contender for the best film in the original trilogy. It's a fiercely poetic and moralistic vision for the character of Luke Skywalker. Oddly enough, it was the exact kind of thing people referenced when describing why they felt Luke Skywalker didn't work in this film. But I disagree. One of the best things The Last Jedi does is add even more meaning to this scene. It does this in a few ways. The scene with the hands is mirrored with Luke's version of the scene where he clashes with Ben, where he looks at his hand while standing over Ben, just like he did with Vader. Some people felt the scene was some kind of character assassination, not what that means, but whatever, meant to rob the culture of one of its great heroes. But that's like a really, really, really stupid thing to think, mainly because of what actually happens in the film. Yes, Luke has this failing, but that justifies him starting at a low point and working his way up to the big heroic stand at the end of the film that culminates in the shot that gives him the end to his arc. The failing itself, the moral failing I mean, has been called nonsense by people who didn't understand the character of Luke Skywalker, and while it's perfectly fine to disagree about the direction in which the character was written, this is also a pretty lazy criticism for someone who is writing out a full essay to make. Luke was the son in his relationship with Anakin, and the student in his relationship with Ben and Yoda. He has no experience with being a father, and limited experience with being a master. These things have only barely been modeled for him. He does, however, have experience being raised by his aunt and uncle. Luke's uncle is emotionally distant and makes decisions for him. Luke doesn't communicate with Ben in this scene. He gets an idea about what might be in store for him, and chooses for him. This is a more lethal and severe version of what Owen Lars was doing to Luke in A New Hope, and I think that fact makes this scene resonate just that little bit more. At the end of The Last Jedi, he holds back the identity of Rey's parents and sacrifices himself so she and her friends can escape, both of which are things Ben Kenobi does for him. Luke went on an arc to become a good student and son in the original trilogy, but now he's also learned what it takes to be a good elder and master. Those are different types of social roles with different qualifications and responsibilities. Just because Luke did one thing while attempting to help his father does not automatically translate to helping Ben. Unlearning and recontextualizing your relationship with younger people as you get older and are forced to expand your horizons is a challenge, not a function of having the right answers early on in life. As Yoda says, we are what they grow beyond. It's a mature version of Luke's self-effacing morality from Return of the Jedi. I think that, far from being an inconsistent misunderstanding, it's a very emotionally intelligent read on the character of Luke Skywalker and who he would be in this circumstance. Luke throwing his saber to reject Rey's offer to return is a clear reference to Luke rejecting the Emperor's offer. The emotional core of this scene is different because its place in the narrative is different, but it's a clear reference nonetheless. When I first saw The Last Jedi, I wanted Luke to use his green lightsaber since I like that one more. And while I still feel the same way, I understand now why he's using the blue one against Kylo Ren. Firstly, since we know that lightsaber was destroyed, it's a hint that this isn't the real Luke, one of several hints we get in that sequence. Secondly, and this is more important, it's a sign that Luke has embraced who Rey was asking him to be, and has picked the lightsaber back up after throwing it, metaphorically speaking. This might sound like a reversal on the inherent non-violence of the original lightsaber throw from Return of the Jedi until you remember that not once does Luke even strike Kylo Ren. All he does is dodge, and he isn't even there in person to begin with, but rather projecting himself through the Force. This is Luke maintaining his old philosophy, but in a new context, with the inventive cleverness and spiritual skill of a real Jedi Master. I could write an entire video essay about Luke Skywalker's character arc, what makes him so great, and why I think it works. But crucially, this is a character who mostly existed inside the original trilogy. The sequel trilogy, as I believe I've established, does far too little to insert new ideas and mostly fixates on older ones, which makes it difficult to imagine what a sequel to these films would even look like. Would it have the poetic meaning that the original trilogy had? It could, but it would be a strong challenge to any director and would probably require a few films to draw out and build up new ideas. In some small ways, The Last Jedi did do that, but it also could have done way more. And I hope that here what I have accomplished is to show what the downside of not doing more is, as well as what the upside of committing to the bit can be. It's not a bad movie, but maybe in another timeline it could have been a truly great one.